The wind whipped through the narrow streets of Loch Dhu, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something faintly metallic that made the hairs on Hamish Macbeth's neck prickle. The village was quiet that morning, too quiet, and the fog clung to the old stone cottages like a shroud. It was the sort of morning that whispered secrets, and Hamish, leaning against the rail of the police station porch, knew instinctively that something had gone terribly wrong. He had barely poured himself a cup of tea when Sergeant Blair came bustling down the lane, eyes wide and breath sharp with urgency. "Hamish, there's been something. You need to see it." Blair's words were clipped, but his unease was obvious. Without a word, Hamish followed him, the chill of the morning pressing in like a living thing. They arrived at Millar's house at the edge of the village, a sprawling, somewhat ramshackle building that had seen better centuries. The front door hung slightly ajar, a strange invitation in itself. Inside, the scene that awaited them was unsettlingly still. Margaret Millar, the lady of the house, was seated in her favourite armchair near the fire, her knitting abandoned, eyes wide in terror. But it wasn't Margaret that had summoned the police. On the polished oak floor, amid a scatter of papers and overturned chairs, lay the body of her husband, Douglas Millar, a local banker known for his genial smile and impeccable manners. Douglas's death was almost theatrical. He lay sprawled beneath the large grandfather clock that dominated the hallway, a thin trickle of blood staining the fine rug. Oddly, there were no signs of a struggle. The door to the room was locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. Windows were secured. It was, by all appearances, a locked room mystery, the kind that had made Hamish's imagination tingle with both excitement and suspicion. But the strangest part, and the detail that had Sergeant Blair pacing the hallway like a caged animal, was the note found next to Douglas's hand. It was written in a careful, almost delicate script, and read simply, "Trust the smile." No signature, no hint at motive, nothing except the odd and cryptic instruction. Hamish crouched to inspect it, feeling a cold draught from the open fireplace. It didn't fit. Douglas had been kind, well-liked, known for his generosity. Who would want him dead? And why leave such a bizarre clue? Hamish's eyes scanned the room, noting small details. The chair slightly askew, a half-filled teacup with lipstick stains, a faint trace of mud at the doorstep, and the scent of garden soil mingling oddly with the sharp tang of blood. Nothing screamed motive. Nothing pointed to a culprit. The only thing that made sense was that nothing made sense, and that in itself was a clue. He rose, letting his gaze linger on Margaret, who was clutching her shawl, trembling. Did Douglas have any enemies? Disputes at the bank? Anyone who might have... His words trailed off. Margaret shook her head, tears brimming. No, Hamish, everyone loved him. He was kind, too kind perhaps. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Hamish felt a familiar tightening in his chest. There was something in that phrase, too kind, that he knew he would need to remember. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the familiar contours of the village. Hamish's thoughts wandered to the note again. Trust the smile, it had said. Could it be literal, figurative? A warning? A taunt? He could not tell yet. But instinct told him the answer lay in the very thing that seemed least threatening, the warmth and kindness Douglas carried in his everyday manner. The contradiction gnawed at him, such an innocent, gentle man, dead under circumstances designed to puzzle the mind. As he moved around the room, Hamish considered the timeline. Margaret had been upstairs when she heard nothing, yet the clock had struck 3, and Douglas's body showed evidence of death only minutes prior to discovery. No one had entered or left. The house was isolated, no footprints outside the mud-marked doorway led anywhere. And that note, so deliberately placed, hinted at intention, cleverness, perhaps even mockery. Had done this wanted it to appear unsolvable, a riddle wrapped in kindness. Hamish rubbed his chin, his mind a quiet storm of possibilities. He glanced once more at the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with serene indifference. A metronome marking time in a world where someone had cheated death and law. Outside, the village held its breath, as if even Loch Dhu itself sensed the danger lingering just beyond familiar faces. Hamish knew, without being told, that this was the beginning of a case that would test not only his wits, but his understanding of human nature. The kindest smiles, he thought, often hid the most deadly secrets. And in that moment, Hamish Macbeth was certain of one thing. Someone in Lochdu had smiled while planning murder, and he intended to find out exactly who and why. Hamish Macbeth stepped lightly over the threshold, his boots quiet against the polished floorboards, and allowed himself a slow, deliberate survey of the room. The constables were already marking out the obvious, taking photographs, dusting for prints, and cataloguing the few objects that seemed out of place, but Hamish's gaze lingered on the subtler, almost imperceptible details, the ones that would escape an ordinary eye. A chair had been nudged slightly to one side, not haphazardly, but with precision, as if moved to make room for something or someone. On the small side table by the window, a silver teaspoon lay atop the lace doily, perfectly clean yet oddly incongruous, as though it had been replaced recently. Hamish knelt to inspect the rug beneath Douglas's body, noting the faint scuff marks near the edge, patterns that suggested a brief struggle but nothing overt. Then his eyes fell upon the teacup. At first glance it seemed innocent, merely a remnant of morning ritual, but the lipstick stain caught his attention. Bright red, yet smeared slightly toward the edge. Not Margaret's soft mauve, but something bolder, sharper. He straightened and studied Margaret, who was quietly sitting on a settee, her fingers entwined, watching him with anxious eyes. There was a flicker of something fleeting in her expression, a hesitation that Hamish couldn't ignore. "Margaret," he said softly, keeping his voice even, almost conversational. "This teacup, did anyone else have tea with Douglas this morning?" Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, Hamish, it was just me. Her voice faltered. She took a small breath and added, "No one else, I swear." Yet her fingers twisted a loose thread on her shawl in a way that suggested tension, a small tell Hamish had learned to trust over years of observation. He allowed a pause, giving her the space to continue, and then turned his attention back to the room. The grandfather clock loomed above, silent now, its pendulum still, yet Hamish noticed a thin scratch along its polished side, hardly visible, but unmistakable to his practised eye. It was too deliberate to be accidental, too subtle to be mere wear. Someone had leaned egg, ain't it, or perhaps used it to steady themselves. Hamish moved to the fireplace, noting that the grate had recently been cleaned. The ash was fine and uniform, yet at the edge, near a small brass shovel, lay a fragment of something, a tiny shard of glass, almost transparent, catching the dim light. He carefully retrieved it with a handkerchief and examined it. Not broken from the clock or any visible vessel, it was small, precise, and yet it must have come from something significant, perhaps a vial, perhaps a tool. Its presence here was deliberate. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and Hamish allowed himself a moment to think. The room spoke in whispers, in subtle contradictions, the clean teacup with lipstick that did not match Margaret's scratch on the grandfather clock, the shard of glass, the slight scuff marks near the rug. Each was a fragment of a story, a hint of movement, of intention. Someone had been here besides Margaret. Someone had manipulated the scene. Hamish's attention then returned to Margaret. Her insistence that she was alone, combined with the small tells of anxiety, did not confirm guilt, but it raised questions. Her words were consistent, yet her body betrayed tiny deceptions. People often spoke the truth while hiding the details they didn't want to reveal, and Hamish had spent too many years in Lochdu to miss the signals. He made his way carefully to the hallway, crouching slightly to examine the floorboards. One board near the doorway had a faint smudge of mud, different in texture from the small traces outside, suggesting it had been tracked in more recently than the footprints Blair had noted. Hamish's gut told him that this was not simply an accident or oversight, it was a deliberate trace, left by someone who had moved quickly, perhaps with intent to mislead. Returning to the centre of the room, Hamish let his eyes sweep over the scene again, slowly piecing together a rough mental map of events. The killer, or killers, had been precise, careful, and observant. The note, "Trust the smile," was not merely a taunt, it was a statement of method. Someone had relied on kindness, on appearances, on the complacency of those around Douglas Millar to cover their actions, and yet, in their meticulous planning, they had left imperfections, and those imperfections were all Hamish needed to begin untangling the web. He straightened, feeling the weight of the investigation settle like a stone in his chest, but with a familiar thrill sparking behind his eyes. He would need to question Margaret further, examine the surroundings meticulously, and perhaps, most importantly, understand the psychology behind a crime that hid its violence behind a veneer of civility. One thing was certain: whoever had moved through this house had left behind subtle signs, faint as whispers, and Hamish Macbeth intended to follow every one of them, no matter how fleeting. Hamish Macbeth led Margaret to a quiet corner of the drawing-room, offering her a chair and a gentle, unassuming presence. He began with small talk, asking about the morning's routine, letting her fill in the details while he observed every twitch of expression, every hesitation in tone. Margaret recounted the usual events with the precise rhythm of someone repeating a familiar story, but her eyes flickered toward the window more than once, as if measuring what lay beyond, calculating the impressions left on him. When Sergeant Blair returned from the neighbouring cottages with the first batch of statements from villagers who might have seen or heard something, Hamish called them in one by one. First came Mrs. Craig, the elderly neighbour who lived across the lane. She claimed she had seen nothing unusual, only that Douglas had appeared cheerful that morning, smiling as he stepped out to check the garden gate. Yet, when Hamish casually asked if she had noticed anyone else, her gaze shifted sharply to the clock, then to Margaret, and she added almost too quickly that she had heard a strange tapping near the front door shortly before Douglas was found. Next was young Alan MacGregor, the miller's son, eager to please and impress. He volunteered that he had seen a figure leaving Millar's house around mid-morning, but "I couldn't see who, sir. It was in the fog." His eagerness was palpable, the sort of zeal that often masked embellishment. Hamish noted the timing carefully. Mid-morning didn't align precisely with the time Margaret had mentioned, and yet the fog was thick enough to obscure details. Was Alan's story a sincere observation, or a convenient insertion to appear helpful? The discrepancy was slight, but in investigations like these, small cracks often led to deeper truths. Hamish then turned his attention back to Margaret, asking again about the people she had interacted with that morning. She insisted it was just her and Douglas, that no one else had been in the house. But Hamish, recalling the teacup with mismatched lipstick and the subtle smudge of mud on the hallway floor, pressed gently, "Are you certain? Even a brief visit, someone at the window, a delivery perhaps?" Margaret's hands tightened over her shawl, and for a fraction of a second her calm composure faltered. "No," she admitted, voice soft. "No one came in. I didn't see anyone, Hamish." The words were true in a sense, but Hamish sensed layers beneath them, truths she either couldn't articulate or chose to hide. Hen came Douglas's assistant, a reserved man named Peter Laird. Peter spoke in clipped sentences, rehearsed and precise. He claimed to have delivered documents to Douglas early that morning, yet his version of Douglas's mood conflicted subtly with the neighbours' accounts. While everyone else described Douglas as cheerful, Peter insisted he seemed distracted, almost tense. Hamish considered the possibility that Peter's observations revealed something he had not yet disclosed, something that could illuminate motive or the presence of another person in the house. Hamish's eyes lingered on the contrasts between the accounts: cheerful Douglas versus distracted Douglas, an unseen visitor versus none at all, a tapping sound reported only by one neighbour. Each narrative contained elements of truth, but each also carried omissions or inconsistencies that could be significant. Hamish understood instinctively that these contradictions weren't accidental. They were shaped by memory, perception, or, more deliberately, by self-interest. He paused, letting the room settle into a hushed tension before asking, "Has anyone at all, behaved oddly, said something that didn't fit, seemed eager to help beyond what is necessary?" Mrs. Craig hesitated, Alan fidgeted, and Peter's lips pressed into a thin line. Margaret's gaze dropped to her lap. Hamish noted these reactions, cataloguing them quietly. Human nature, he knew, often betrayed hidden motives not through words but through the small spaces between them. After some silence, Hamish stood and moved toward the fireplace again, pretending to examine the mantel, yet listening carefully. "Trust the smile," he murmured under his breath, recalling the note beside Douglas's body. The phrase echoed differently now, through the voices he had just heard. Smiles, cheer, and politeness could conceal evasions, half-truths, and deliberate deceit. Whoever had moved through the house had done so knowing people would see what they expected to see, not what actually occurred. By the time the last witness left, Hamish had already begun piecing together the first tentative threads of deceit. There was more here than a simple, isolated crime. There were hidden motives, careful manipulations, and someone relying on kindness as camouflage. Each account, each half-truth, each flicker of hesitation was a small window into the labyrinth of human behaviour he now had to navigate. In Loch Dhu, where everyone knew everyone else, the real danger was not the stranger, but the familiar face hiding secrets behind a courteous smile, and Hamish Macbeth, as always, intended to uncover every one of them. Hamish sat quietly in the corner of Millar's sitting room after the witnesses had gone, letting the quiet stretch and settle around him. The voices, the half-truths, and the contradictions lingered in his mind like fragments of a broken mirror, each reflecting part of the scene but never the whole picture. He began to untangle the threads, moving slowly, deliberately, like a fisherman casting a net across a shadowed loch, feeling for the faintest tug of reality beneath the surface. Douglas Millar had been well liked, almost universally admired, but as Hamish considered the people closest to him, he realised how much human nature thrived beneath the veneer of civility. Margaret's nervous glances and subtle evasions suggested more than just grief. Peter Laird's precision and the almost mechanical way he described Douglas's demeanour hinted at both loyalty and restraint, a man who knew more than he was willing to say. Alan MacGregor's eagerness to impress hinted at vanity or a need to be noticed, perhaps hiding embarrassment or misjudgment. Even Mrs. Craig, gentle and polite, had the faintest trace of hesitation, as though she knew something but feared the consequences of speaking. Brr. Hamish leaned back and traced the timeline in his mind. Douglas had risen early, as usual, and Margaret claimed she had been upstairs for most of the morning. Peter had delivered documents, all, and claimed to have glimpsed a figure outside, and the neighbours had heard a tapping. Then the body had been discovered, and the cryptic note left behind. All of it suggested precision and calculation, but what could drive someone to commit such an act in a way so meticulously designed to mislead? Greed, jealousy, revenge? Each possibility seemed plausible, yet none fully explained the evidence, the timing, and the subtle manipulations of the scene. He recalled the shard of glass, the scuff marks, the lipstick-stained teacup, and the scratch on the grandfather clock. Each pointed to human interference, small and deliberate, a language of intention. Yet the motive remained murky. Could it have been financial? Douglas was a banker, yes, but there was no evidence of immediate threat or embezzlement. Could it have been personal? A secret quarrel hidden behind smiles and pleasantries? The human heart, Hamish mused, was often far more complex than the surface suggested. He began to map the connections, considering who stood to gain, who might feel slighted, who might act from fear or envy. Margaret, though devoted, would inherit the estate, yet her gestures were inconsistent with simple financial motive. Peter Laird had access and opportunity, yet his demeanour suggested caution rather than malice. Alan, youthful and impressionable, had motive only if he believed it would impress someone, yet the careful staging of the crime seemed beyond the recklessness of youth. Even Mrs. Craig's hesitation suggested knowledge or complicity, though what that could be remained unclear. Hamish's thoughts returned to the note. Trust the smile. It seemed to link directly to human behaviour, the deliberate use of kindness as a mask. The crime had been executed in a way that relied upon others' assumptions, on their expectations of Douglas's goodness and Margaret's composure, on the trust place. In appearances, whoever had done this had counted on that trust to manipulate the scene, to cover their motive. He rose and walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the fog-draped village. Each cottage, each shadowed lane seemed suddenly alive with possibilities. Motive, he realized, was never singular. In Loch-Dhu, every human connection was tangled, envy mixed with loyalty, fear with affection, desire with frustration. To understand the crime, he would need to untangle that web, following each thread carefully, considering every possible interplay of emotion and intention. Returning to the room, Hamish examined the documents Peter had delivered, the accounts, letters, and notes Douglas had handled that morning. Small discrepancies appeared, entries that seemed routine but had been edited, a ledger slightly out of order, a correspondence that might hint at tension or negotiation. Each was a potential clue, yet none was definitive. The picture remained incomplete, a maze of motives without a clear path. Hamish felt the familiar stir of anticipation. He did not yet have the solution, but the outlines of a plan were forming. He would need to speak with each person again, carefully probing the contradictions, observing their reactions to subtle pressure, listening for the tiny shifts that betrayed hidden truths. Greed, jealousy, fear, devotion. Any combination could drive someone to murder, but only one could explain: the meticulous execution, the staged scene, and the cryptic note. As the fog thickened outside, and the shadows lengthened in the room, Hamish felt the first real sense of direction. The motives were tangled, yes, a labyrinth of human emotion and ambition, but each clue, each hesitation, each faint imperfection in the polished facade brought him closer to the centre. Somewhere in that maze, he knew, lay the heart of the crime, and he would follow it patey. Until the killer's smile was revealed for what it truly was, Hamish Macbeth spent the rest of the afternoon retracing movements and examining minutiae in Millar's house. A slow, deliberate process that had the constables sighing and muttering about wasted time. Their impatience grew when, shortly after evening fell, Sergeant Blair burst in with triumphant news. "Hamish, you'll never guess. We've got it. A fingerprint on the teacup. We ran it through the system, and it's a perfect match, Alan MacGregor." The younger constables exchanged glances, slapping each other on the back, congratulating themselves on what appeared to be a swift resolution. Hamish turned the teacup over in his hands, his brow furrowing. Indeed, the print matched Alan, but something about the declaration felt off, a gnawing unease that refused to be ignored. Alan had been eager to help. Yes, his story had slight embellishments, and his fingerprints on a teacup used for tea seemed plausible. Yet the subtle clues, the scuff marks near the grandfather clock, the shard of glass, the deliberate placement of the note, did not align with the impulsive recklessness of a teenager seeking attention. Something deeper, something more deliberate, lingered beneath the surface. Constables were already drafting their report, confident in their early triumph. "It all fits," Blair said. "He had the opportunity, the presence at the scene, and now the print. It's solved, Hamish. We can close the file." Hamish nodded, outwardly calm, but inside his mind was working rapidly. A solved case did not mean the right case had been solved. He had learned long ago that appearances were often deceiving, and this was a prime example. He studied Alan, who sat nervously on a chair, twisting his cap in his hands. The boy's eyes were wide, almost pleading, eager to accept the blame, to escape scrutiny, or perhaps to appear grown-up in the eyes of the adults around him. But Hamish noticed something else, a subtle deflection whenever the shard of glass or the scratch on the clock was mentioned, a flicker of recognition that quickly vanished. It was enough to tell Hamish that Alan had seen something he wasn't saying, but it did not make him the killer. Hamish quietly pulled Blair aside, lowering his voice. "We need to look closer at this. That fingerprint proves he handled the cup, yes, but it doesn't place him at the exact moment of the crime, nor does it explain the careful staging. There's more here. The real puzzle hasn't been solved." Blair's expression hardened, but he allowed Hamish to continue. The sergeant trusted him, but impatience and the relief of a supposed solution made him sceptical. Alone again, Hamish retraced the sequence in his mind. The killer had entered, executed the murder with calculated precision, and left the scene to implicate someone else. Alan's fingerprint on the teacup could be a consequence of normal household interaction, not a mark of guilt. Hamish's gaze drifted toward the note, the cryptic command still echoing in his mind. Trust the smile. Whoever had written it was confident, clever, and patient. A mind that could think several moves ahead of the village constabulary. Hamish decided to speak with Alan alone, gently, quietly. "Alan," he said, leaning forward, "you've told me everything you remember. But sometimes people see more than they think. Did you notice anything unusual? Something out of place?" The boy hesitated, biting his lip, then whispered, I saw someone moving near the window, but I didn't think they mattered. They were too quick and I got scared." His words were rushed, frightened, but precise. Hamish's heart tightened. This confirmed what he had suspected. The true criminal was careful, moving in shadows, leaving only misleading traces. By the time night fell, the constables were ready to declare the case closed, and villagers whispered about the boy's culpability. Yet Hamish remained seated in the dim light of the Miller drawing-room, the notes, scuffs, and fragments arrayed in his mind like pieces of a board game he had yet to master. The victory felt hollow, too simple, too neat. The real criminal was still out there, biding their time, confident that suspicion had been misdirected. Hamish looked toward the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging in silent, inevitable rhythm. Every tick was a reminder that time worked in favour of patience and careful observation. Somewhere, in the fog-shrouded lanes of Loch Dhu, a smile, kind, friendly, entirely convincing, mastermind capable of murder. The case, he knew, was far from over. The false victory had only set the stage, and Hamish Macbeth would be ready for the next move, watching, waiting, and following every shadow until the truth finally emerged. Hamish Macbeth sat in the quiet of the police office the following morning, sunlight struggling through the mist that clung to Loch Dhu like a stubborn memory. While the constables were preoccupied with formalities and Alan's reluctant confession, Hamish's mind kept wandering back to fragments of information he had almost dismissed. A brief remark from Peter Laird about a long-forgotten dispute at the bank, a casual comment Mrs. Craig had made months ago about a missing ledger, and a scrap-o. Gossip about Douglas's early career that had seemed irrelevant at the time. Small things, buried under the weight of immediacy, suddenly began to glow with importance. He pulled open an old ledger from the back of the Millar archive, a dusty, leather-bound volume that had not been consulted in years. Its pages, filled with neat entries and precise sums, hinted at financial entanglements that no one had noticed. Hamish's eyes caught a faint notation in the margin, almost smudged, a transaction between Douglas Millar and a man named Crawford, dated nearly a decade earlier. The name stirred a faint recollection. Hamish had investigated a minor case years ago involving the same Crawford, a fraud scheme that had left victims disgraced and debts unpaid. Most had assumed the matter closed, but now, in the quiet light of this room, Hamish felt the thread reconnecting. The connection, once dim, grew sharper. Peter Laird had mentioned Crawford in passing, always careful, never overtly, but now it seemed deliberate. Could Douglas's past dealings have returned to haunt him? Hamish traced the edges of memory, recalling a conversation with Mrs. Craig during the summer festival years back, when she had hinted at a falling out between Douglas and a local businessman, something best left alone. At the time, it had seemed idle chatter. Now, with the murder staged so deliberately, it felt like a whisper from the past, a warning that someone had been waiting, watching, remembering. Hamish turned his attention to the others, searching for links previously overlooked. Alan MacGregor's presence was coincidental in some ways, but not in others. His father had worked briefly at the bank under Douglas a decade ago, leaving under mysterious circumstances, grievances Hamish had never fully examined. The pieces began to align, past disputes, old grudges, and hidden resentments had quietly accumulated, lated, shaping motives that no immediate observation could reveal. The crime, Hamish realized, was a product not just of present circumstance, but of years of unresolved tensions. He revisited Margaret Millar's behaviour with fresh eyes. Her nervous glances and hesitations had seemed typical of grief, but combined with this historical context, they hinted at more. Perhaps she knew the history, understood the lingering dangers, and had tried, subtly, to protect Douglas from old shadows she feared might rise again. The kindness and composure she displayed were shields, but Hamish wondered whether she might have unintentionally obscured the true trail of the killer. Returning to Peter Laird, Hamish examined his demeanour carefully. The man's precise, careful recounting of Douglas's last moments now took on new significance. His loyalty was evident, but so was his intimate knowledge of Douglas's past dealings. Peter had been present during many of the old transactions, aware of the grudges that festered quietly, and the shard of glass, the teacup, the scuff marks, they might have been inserted by someone exploiting that past, counting on human assumptions to misdirect suspicion. Hamish's gaze drifted to the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with silent persistence. Time, he realized, had been a tool for the murderer, not just in executing the crime with careful timing, but in using the history of the Millar household and its connections to mask intention. The killer had relied on the assumption that old cases were forgotten, old grudges irrelevant, yet the past never truly fades. It waits, patient and watchful, until someone misreads its quiet warning. By the afternoon, Hamish had sketched a rough map of connections, aligning past grievances with present opportunities. The murder was no isolated act of impulse. It was the culmination of long-simmering resentment, filter, read through the carefully orchestrated appearances of kindness and civility that Douglas and those around him had taken for granted. Shadows from the past had moved forward, unseen yet inevitable, shaping every decision, every misstep. Hamish leaned back, letting the realization settle. The case had shifted, transformed from a simple, seemingly straightforward puzzle into a layered web of history and human emotion. Whoever had struck had studied the past as closely as the present, weaving it into a trap designed to mislead and confound. And Hamish Macbeth knew, with the quiet certainty that had guided him through countless mysteries, that understanding those shadows was the only path to uncovering the true killer lurking among the familiar faces of Loch-Dhu. Hamish Macbeth returned to Millar's house later that evening, the fog thickening in the village streets, as if shielding secrets from the casual observer. He moved quietly through the familiar rooms, examining once again the subtle signs of human activity, scuff marks, the faint residue of a footprint, the shard of glass still lying unnoticed near the fireplace. Each detail, seemingly small, added another brushstroke to the evolving picture of the crime. But what he needed now was more than observation. He needed to provoke a reaction, to unsettle the carefully constructed calm that masked the truth. He called Margaret Millar into the drawing room, not with accusation, but with a peculiar request. "Margaret," he said, speaking softly, "I'd like you to help me understand something. I want you to tell me how Douglas might have reacted if he had discovered someone close to him had betrayed his trust." He watched her carefully, noting the natural warmth of her expression, the slight tilt of her head, and the way her hands twitched against the folds of her shawl. Margaret paused, clearly taken aback by the hypothetical. I suppose he would have been hurt," she said slowly. "But he wouldn't have shown it openly. Douglas always tried to see the best in people. That was his way." Her voice was measured, calm, but Hamish caught the slight quiver beneath it. A subtle honesty, or perhaps the shadow of memory brushing too close to present unease, flickered through her words. Next, he asked Peter Laird to join them under a similar pretext. "Peter, imagine you were responsible for something that went terribly wrong, something that hurt someone you respected deeply. How would you respond? How would you hide or reveal your guilt?" Peter's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He gave the expected, practiced answer, emphasizing duty, loyalty, and careful control of emotion. Yet his hands betrayed a slight tremor, and a bead of sweat formed near his temple. Hamish noted it, cataloguing it quietly. It was the tiniest crack in a mask that had so far seemed flawless. Hamish then guided the conversation toward the shard of glass. He casually mentioned it, describing it as a hypothetical item left behind by someone who might have panicked or dropped it accidentally during a hurried visit. His words were casual, even playful, yet laden with suggestion. Margaret's eyes flicked to the shard, lingering longer than necessary, while Peter's gaze drifted toward the fireplace, then back to Hamish, as if he had suddenly realized the subtle trap laid within the conversation. The most revealing reaction, however, came from Alan MacGregor, who had been observing quietly in the corner. Hamish spoke gently, almost conspiratorially, of a person who might have felt pressured to cover for another, someone who feared the consequences if the truth came to light. Alan flinched, his small frame stiffening, yet he said nothing. But Hamish saw the flicker, an involuntary tightening of the jaw, a shift in posture, that betrayed more than words ever could. It was a small, human admission of fear and complicity, even if the precise details remained concealed. Hamish smiled faintly to himself, realizing the method was working. He had created a space where pretense met gentle challenge, where careful stories and rehearsed statements collided with subtle psychological pressure. Each suspect had revealed, in the most minute gestures and micro-expressions, elements of discomfort and recognition. These were not confessions, but they were far more valuable. They were cracks in the carefully polished surfaces of lies, the small openings through which the truth could seep. He lingered near the grandfather clock, letting the conversation flow while he observed. The pendulum swung in its slow, relentless rhythm, a silent metronome against the shifting human emotions around him. He could sense, with increasing certainty, that the murderer was someone who relied on control and patience, someone who had studied both Douglas and the village for years, knowing precisely how to manipulate appearances. By the end of the evening, Hamish had a clearer sense of the web of reactions. No single glance or twitch was decisive, but the pattern was emerging. Margaret's subtle anxieties, Peter's almost imperceptible tremors, Alan's fearful flinches, they all pointed to a story carefully concealed, one in which deception and history intertwined. The unconventional tactic, this quiet psychological test, had revealed what evidence alone could not. Human emotion, even when guarded, has a language of its own. And in that language, Hamish Macbeth could already hear the faint, distinct echo of the murderer's presence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The next morning, Hamish returned to Miller's house with a sense of purpose, determined to follow up on the threads he had observed the night before. The fog hung thick over Loch Dhu, muting colours and swallowing sound, and the village itself seemed hushed, as if aware that secrets were stirring once again. Hamish moved deliberately through the rooms, mentally reviewing each clue: the shard of glass near the fireplace, the scuff marks by the grandfather clock, the lipstick-stained teacup, the cryptic note, "Trust the smile." Each had felt like a small thread leading toward the murderer, and now he intended to pull them all together. But when he reached the fireplace, his stomach sank. The shard of glass was gone. He scanned the floor carefully, crouching low, but it had vanished without a trace. His eyes flicked to the mantel and the hearth, noting the faint trace of disturbance in the dust where it had lain. Someone had removed it deliberately. Hamish's mind raced. The shard had been small, subtle, almost insignificant, yet it was one of the few tangible pieces of evidence pointing to careful manipulation of the scene. Its disappearance suggested intent, a deliberate effort to mislead, to erase a trail before he could follow it. He called Blair to the house immediately. The sergeant arrived within minutes, breathless and anxious. "It's gone?" he said, eyes scanning the hearth. Hamish nodded, crouching to indicate the faint disturbance in the dust. "Yes, someone has been here since we last saw it. They know this evidence matters. They're trying to bury the truth." Blair muttered a curse under his breath, clearly frustrated by the setback. But who? No one else had access. Hamish stood, letting his gaze sweep the room. His mind catalogued every potential suspect: Margaret, Peter, Alan, even the neighbours, anyone who could move through the house without drawing attention. He considered the timing. The house had been under watch overnight, yet somehow the shard had vanished. This was not a careless theft. It was precise, executed with knowledge of its significance. Someone was actively working against him, trying to manipulate not just the evidence but the entire trajectory of the investigation. He retraced his steps, examining the grandfather clock and the hallway where scuff marks had suggested movement. Nothing else appeared disturbed, yet the absence of the shard now made every other detail more critical. The teacup, the note, the scratch, each became a point of reference in a landscape suddenly more treacherous. Whoever had taken the shard understood the importance of the small, almost invisible traces. It was a calculated move, designed to misdirect and delay, to sow doubt in the minds of those pursuing the truth. Hamish called Margaret into the room under a quiet pretext, watching her closely. Her reaction was subtle, a blink, a faint flush on her cheeks, a hesitation before speaking. Did anyone come in last night?" he asked gently. She shook her head, but Hamish noticed a brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Even if she were innocent, someone close to her, or someone she trusted, might have moved silently through the house. The realization tightened the coil of suspicion in Hamish's mind. Trust, he now knew, was a fragile thing. Peter Laird arrived shortly after, and Hamish observed him under the guise of casual conversation. Peter's composure was intact, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a slight tightening around the shoulders when the shard was mentioned. Hamish catalogued it quietly, aware that human reaction often betrayed what spoken words tried to conceal. Alan, when brought into the room to observe, seemed nervous but unaware of the shard's disappearance. His youthful attention was drawn elsewhere, yet Hamish suspected he had seen someone moving outside the window the previous day. The implications settled heavily on Hamish's shoulders. The murderer, or perhaps an accomplice, was still active, still capable of manoeuvring in plain sight. Each day brought not just revelations but obstacles deliberately placed to hinder the pursuit of truth. The fog outside pressed against the windows, thick and concealing, as if the village itself conspired with those who sought to bury secrets. Hamish stepped back from the hearth, his eyes narrowing, mind sharp. The vanishing shard was more than just a missing fragment of glass. It was a message, a warning, a confirmation that the killer was patient, clever, and intimately familiar with the investigation. Every step forward now carried risk. Every assumption required scrutiny. Trust had to be measured carefully, alliances reconsidered, and every human reaction observed with renewed intensity. The game had shifted, and Hamish Macbeth knew that only by moving more carefully than ever could he hope to corner the criminal. Lurking in the shadows, waiting to manipulate the next misstep. Hamish Macbeth had barely begun to process the implications of the vanished shard when a sharp, insistent ringing at the police station phone pulled him from his thoughts. Sergeant Blair answered first, but the urgency in his voice made Hamish's stomach tighten. "Hamish, you'd better come quick. It's Peter Laird. Something's happened at the mill." Within minutes, Hamish was striding through the fog-laden streets of Lochdu, Blair hurrying at his side, boots sloshing through the puddles left by overnight drizzle. The mill, a crumbling stone structure at the edge of the village, seemed to loom with a grim anticipation. As they arrived, the constables were already forming a perimeter, but the scene that greeted Hamish was worse than he expected. Peter Laird's office, a small room tucked behind the main floor, had been ransacked. Papers were scattered, shelves overturned, and in the midst of the chaos, a faint trail of blood led to the back door. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in his mind, though outside there was only the thick, choking fog. Hamish moved carefully into the room, noting the signs of struggle, the tipped chair, the indentation in the rug, and the overturned inkstand, its contents staining a page of carefully handwritten ledgers. There was no body, yet something about the scene spoke clearly. Someone had intended harm, and perhaps had achieved it, at least partially. Peter Laird was missing. The notion hit Hamish sharply. The murderer was still free, and the stakes had escalated far beyond observation or deduction. Blair muttered nervously, "Someone's taken him, or worse." Hamish's eyes scanned the room, settling on a small detail almost easily overlooked, a single sheet of paper, pinned under the chair leg, partially obscured. Carefully he lifted it. In neat, deliberate handwriting. NG was the same cryptic style as the first note. "Trust the calm. The next move is revealed." It was taunting, arrogant, and chilling. A clear message that the killer knew Hamish was closing in and intended to manipulate the investigation with each step. Hamish's mind raced. The vanishing shard, the careful manipulation of the scene at Millar's house, and now Peter's disappearance painted a pattern. Someone patient, meticulous, and several steps ahead, willing to escalate when cornered. The killer was no longer merely hiding behind appearances. They were actively shaping events, daring the detective to react too slowly. The sense of urgency tightened like a noose. Each hour now carried the potential for another act of violence, another calculated strike. He turned to the constables. "We need to find him before it's too late," Hamish said, his voice low but firm. "Search every route out of the village. Ask everyone who's been near the mill overnight. Look for footprints, disturbances, any sign of movement. He's clever, but he leaves traces, always." Hamish's own observations told him that the person responsible thrived on psychological control. The disappearance was meant to distract, to mislead, to make them feel like they were always reacting instead of acting. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the stone walls, swallowing sound and muffling the village beyond. Hamish's thoughts turned to the human connections he had been mapping, the grudges, the debts, the quiet resentments lingering from Douglas Millar's past. Whoever had taken Peter was exploiting that intricate web of emotion and history, manipulating both fear and trust. Every human reaction, every subtle hesitation noted the previous evening, could now be a clue to Peter's location, or a trap to mislead him further. Hamish's gaze returned to the empty office, the scattered papers, the dark stains on the rue. The killer had shifted the battle from the scene of the crime to the very heart of the investigation itself. The threat was immediate, and the rules had changed. It was no longer about reconstructing a past event, but about preventing the next one. His calm, steady approach would now be tested against someone as cunning as he was patient, someone who had mastered the art of anticipation. He drew a deep breath and stepped back into the misty streets of Loch Dhu, boots splashing through shallow puddles, mind focused on the task ahead. The disappearance of Peter Laird had transformed the investigation. No longer could Hamish afford patience alone. He had to act decisively, to anticipate the moves of a mind that thrived in shadow and deception. Somewhere in the fog the killer waited, confident in their control, and Hamish Macbeth knew that if he did not uncover their strategy quickly, another life, or more, would hang in the balance. Hamish Macbeth spent the following morning walking slowly through Loch Dhu, retracing every route from Millar's house to the mill, letting his eyes and mind sweep over the familiar streets with the precision of someone looking for shadows in the light. The fog still clung stubbornly, curling around corners and swallowing the edges of rooftops. Yet for Hamish it was now less a hindrance than a companion. It muted distraction, focused attention, and gave him space to think. He reviewed every clue, every hesitation, every subtle human reaction he had observed. The shard of glass, the teacup, the scratch on the clock, Peter Laird's disappearance, and the cryptic notes. It was a minor detail that finally made the pattern click. He recalled Mrs. Craig's remark about a strange tapping near the Millar front door, something initially dismissed as irrelevant. He had filed it away, as had the constables, too caught up in fingerprints and timelines to see its significance. But now, in the context of Peter's disappearance, the subtle repetition of movement became glaringly clear. Each time the killer struck or manipulated the scene, there had been a deliberate, almost rhythmic disturbance, a tap on the window, a scuff on the floor, the displaced chair at the mill. It was as if the murderer left a faint signature, not for evidence in the usual sense, but to orchestrate the flow of human perception, to direct attention where they wanted it and away from where the truth lay. Hamish returned to Millar's house, walking the familiar hallway, noting how each scuff and imperfection seemed less random than he had initially assumed. He crouched to inspect the area near the grandfather clock, the same place where he had observed the thin scratch days before. The mark aligned perfectly with the rhythm he had now recognized, a subtle, repeated action, a precise footstep, a careful nudge, almost like punctuation. Every time the killer moved in these rooms, whether entering, staging, or exiting, there had been this meticulous cadence, so small it went unnoticed, yet consistent enough to reveal a method. Even the cryptic notes took on new meaning. Trust the smile and trust the calm, the next move is revealed, were not only taunts but instructions, a reflection of the murderer's reliance on human psychology and expectation. The villain had calculated every hesitation, every assumption, knowing that kindness and composure would be taken at face value. And now, armed with this insight, Hamish could trace the flow of events not just by what happened, but by how the killer expected people to react. Returning to the mill, Hamish examined the chaotic office once more. The scattered papers, the spilled ink, the overturned chair, all were deliberate, yet there had been one object misplaced in a way no one had noticed before. A ledger half-p, old from a drawer, its position slightly askew. It was subtle enough to seem accidental, but the alignment was consistent with the rhythm Hamish had identified. The ledger's position pointed toward a direction of movement within the room, the intended path of whoever had taken Peter, leaving only the minimal trace necessary to manipulate pursuit and attention. Hamish's mind worked through the implications. The pattern revealed a mind that thrived on subtlety, on repetition, on the meticulous orchestration of human behavior. The killer was patient, confident in the assumption that ordinary observation would never catch the deliberate rhythm of their actions. Yet once the pattern emerged, the entire sequence of crimes, Douglas Millar's murder, the vanished shard, Peter Laird's disappearance, even the minor disturbances previously dismissed, aligned like pieces of a puzzle, forming a coherent, chillingly precise plan. He called Sergeant Blair, instructing him to review every minor irregularity in reports and witness statements. "Look at the small things, Blair," Hamish said. "The things we thought were trivial. The taps, the scuffs, the objects slightly moved. They're not random. They're part of a rhythm. Whoever is behind this has been leaving their signature all along." Blair listened, the sergeant's usual impatience tempered by the gravity in Hamish's voice. As Hamish walked back to the station, the realization settled into his mind like a lantern illuminating a long dark path. The killer's intelligence had been underestimated. The truth had been in plain sight, hidden only because no one had thought to examine the mundane, the habitual, the repeated. Now, with the pattern emerging, Hamish could anticipate the moves, predict the rhythms, and follow the path that would lead him directly to the mind orchestrating the chaos. Lochdu, in its quiet fog, suddenly seemed argied with potential, every street, every house, every shadow a clue waiting to be understood. And Hamish Macbeth, attuned to the cadence of the unseen, felt the first real certainty he had had since the first note was discovered. The killer was clever, but even the cleverest rhythms can be traced, and he was ready to follow. Hamish Macbeth returned to the quiet of Millar's house later that evening, the village cloaked in mist and shadow, every familiar corner suddenly imbued with potential significance. He moved slowly through the rooms, retracing the paths of both Douglas Millar and the unseen hands that had staged the crime. The pattern he had discerned, the subtle scuffs, the shifted objects, the rhythmic micro-actions, had revealed the killer's meticulous mind, but it still did not explain the why. The motive remained buried, hidden behind layers of careful behavior and psychological manipulation. He started with Margaret, whose composure and kindness had long been a shield. Hamish observed her quietly, noting the faint traces of tension in her posture, the nervous way she smoothed her hands over her skirt as she recounted small, trivial details of the day Douglas had died. Then he brought up Peter Laird, carefully framing the question around loyalty rather than suspicion. "People sometimes act out of fear, Margaret," he said gently, "or they act to protect someone else. Did Douglas ever speak of anyone who might have felt wronged?" Margaret hesitated, the stillness in her gaze betraying a memory she had tried to suppress. She exhaled slowly, then murmured, "Years ago. Douglas trusted someone he thought loyal. But that trust, it was betrayed. I thought it was behind us, that it no longer mattered." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight Hamish could feel. She had unintentionally exposed a thread stretching back far beyond the surface mow. Tithes he had considered. Hamish's mind raced, connecting the dots. The ledger from years ago, the transactions with Crawford, Peter Laird's knowledge of past dealings, all were pieces of a larger psychological picture. The killer had not been motivated solely by greed, revenge, or jealousy. Those were convenient covers. distractions to disguise a far deeper drive, an obsession with control, a desire to assert superiority over those who had wronged them in the past. The first murder, the vanishing shard, the staged scene at the mill, Peter's disappearance, every action had been calculated, not just to mislead but to reassert dominance, to manipulate lives in a precise, deliberate choreography. He turned his attention to Peter Laird's disappearance. Whoever had taken him was not merely punishing. They were orchestrating a psychological statement. Each move had been designed to instill fear, to demonstrate omnipresence and mastery over circumstances. The killer's mind thrived on the tension between appearance and reality, delighting in the discrepancy between what others assumed and what had truly occurred. This was not impulsive. It was methodical, almost ritualistic. Hamish paced slowly through the hallway, retracing the minor scuff marks and disturbances he had catalogued before. Each detail now illuminated a part of the villain's psyche. The shard of glass had been removed not out of necessity, but as a symbolic act, eliminating an element that might have threatened the carefully constructed illusion of control. The notes were taunts, psychological probes, tests of his ability to read human behavior. Everything was deliberate, designed to assert intellectual dominance over the investigators and the victims alike. In the stillness of the evening, Hamish reflected on the pattern of prior grudges, the carefully maintained distances, the old resentments that had festered quiet. The killer's obsession was not with money, position, or revenge in the conventional sense. It was with authority, trust, and manipulation, the power to dictate perception and reaction, to orchestrate fear and obedience without ever being caught in the act. The surface motives, financial, relational, professional, were merely camouflage for the deeper compulsion driving the crimes. He finally spoke aloud, almost to himself, summarizing the revelation. The crime was a meticulously constructed exercise in dominance and control. The villain had operated with precision, exploiting human assumptions, historical grievances, and the careful psychology of the people around Douglas. The murders and the disappearance were not acts of anger, but calculated demonstrations of mastery, meant to reinforce the killer's own sense of superiority, and the illusion that they were untouchable. Hamish's eyes swept over the drawing room, noting once more the subtle disturbances and residual signs of manipulation. The pieces fell into place. Douglas had been targeted because he represented trust, predictability, and authority, all the things the killer sought to control or undermine. Margaret's kindness, Peter's loyalty, Alan's eagerness, even Mrs. Craig's small hesitations. Every human reaction had been used as part of a psychological experiment in fear and obedience. The shocking truth was that the motive was not just about who gained or lost, but about the killer's compulsion to dominate the lives of others, to orchestrate outcomes with precision, and to ensure that the consequences of their own careful planning were felt in every emotional response they could provoke. For the first time, the pieces of the puzzle, past grievances, present manipulations, and subtle human reactions, formed a coherent whole. Hamish Macbeth understood, with the clarity of careful deduction and the weight of instinct, that he was now confronting not merely a criminal but a mind driven by obsession, capable of predicting and controlling behavior in ways that made even the most ordinary human gestures meaningful. The hidden motive, long obscured, had finally emerged, revealing a villain whose crimes were as much psychological as they were physical, and whose danger had only begun to reveal itself. Hamish Macbeth spent the morning mapping the final steps, the rhythm of the killer's actions now etched clearly in his mind. The fog still lay thick over Loch Dhu, curling through narrow streets and hiding alleys that had once seemed innocuous, but now took on the weight of potential danger. He had studied the pattern, traced the psychological signature, and understood the hidden motive, control, dominance, and the compulsion to manipulate human behavior. The killer had been patient, but Hamish had learned that patience could be countered with precision. He called Margaret quietly to the drawing room under the pretense of reviewing some household accounts. Peter Laird had been located, unharmed but shaken, hidden in the abandoned boathouse along the loch. His safe return confirmed what Hamish had suspected. The villain's confidence had relied on intimidation rather than immediate violence. The trap now needed only the right bait. the one subtle, irresistible lure that would provoke the killer to reveal themselves. Hamish arranged the setting carefully. He allowed the rumour of a final, decisive breakthrough, carefully seeded through Blair and the other constables, to reach the village, that a crucial piece of evidence had surfaced, something that could definitively link the murderer to the first crime. He knew the killer would be drawn by their compulsion, compelled to act, to assert control one last time and reveal their hand. As afternoon bled into evening, the house seemed to settle in. To a tense stillness, Hamish waited, standing near the grandfather clock, the pendulum swinging steadily, a metronome to his own patient vigilance. Each scuff, each whisper of the wind against the windows, carried weight now. And then a shadow moved near the front door, deliberate but tentative, testing, as if seeking permission or evaluating risk. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The door creaked, and a figure slipped inside, careful, composed, masked by an outward smile that Hamish had long since learned to read for deception rather than warmth. It was Peter's accountant, Mr. Crawford, a man whose interactions with Douglas Millar had long been recorded in ledgers, letters, and whispered rumours. His expression was calm, almost cordial, but Hamish saw the micro-expressions, the minute tension in his shoulders and hands, the way his gaze flicked to the objects he had manipulated in previous moves. "Crawford," Hamish said evenly, his voice carrying calm authority without accusation. "I've been expecting you." Crawford froze, the smile faltering for the briefest instant. He recovered quickly, but it was enough. Hamish had seen enough subtle cracks to know the man's psychology would betray him under pressure. I don't know what you mean," Crawford said, voice carefully neutral. He took a step forward, attempting to regain composure, but Hamish's presence was a quiet cage. Every avenue of escape, every familiar manipulation had been anticipated. "You've enjoyed your control for far too long," Hamish continued, moving slowly but purposefully toward him. The scuffs, the notes, the missing shard of glass, Peter's disappearance, it was all part of your rhythm. And yet, here you are, compelled to check, to see if the evidence you tried to erase has been discovered. Crawford's face twitched, a subtle quiver that revealed the strain of maintaining his elaborate facade. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick as the fog outside. Then, almost imperceptibly, Crawford made a move, stepping toward the mantel as if to retrieve something, a last desperate effort. Hamish anticipated it, his hand brushing the revolver tucked at his side, though he did not need to draw. "Stop," he said calmly, eyes fixed on the man. "It ends here. You've manipulated enough. The pattern, the rhythm, it has been traced, and you are now cornered." Crawford froze, the desperation in his posture giving way to a flicker of fear. "You don't understand," he hissed, voice low and sharp. "It wasn't about them. It was about proving I could—" His words trailed off, meaningless under the weight of the careful observation that had dismantled his control. Hamish stepped closer, patient, composed, knowing the final act of the killer's psychological game was inevitable. Crawford's breathing grew uneven, his composure crumbling, revealing the obsessive compulsion that had driven him to murder, manipulation, and intimidation. The man's need to dominate, to orchestrate fear and obedience, had been his undoing, laid bare by careful anticipation and the simple, unrelenting observation of human behaviour. By the time the constables entered to formally arrest Crawford, Hamish had already catalogued every subtle movement, every gesture that exposed the killer's psychology. The final confrontation was complete, not with force, but with insight, patience, and the quiet certainty of a mind attuned to rhythm, motive, and human frailty. Lockdoor exhaled, the fog outside pressing gently against the windows, and for the first time in days, the village could sense that the shadows of control and fear had finally lifted, leaving the truth revealed in the careful hands of Hamish Macbeth. Hamish Macbeth had spent the evening overseeing Crawford's removal, watching the constables escort the defeated man down the misty streets of Lochdoe. The village seemed to breathe again, the fog lifting just enough to reveal familiar rooftops and chimneys, though the shadows still clung to corners and alleys, reminders that even the calmest night could conceal secrets. Hamish felt a cautious relief, yet instinctively he remained vigilant. In cases like this, resolution often came with the quietest, most insidious surprises. He returned to Millar's house to check on Margaret and Alan, both of whom were shaken, but unharmed. As he walked through the rooms, his mind replayed the rhythm of the events, the careful manipulation of evidence, the pattern he had uncovered, and the psychological profile he had pieced together. Everything had pointed to Crawford, the ledger transactions, the familiarity with Millar's habits, the staged notes, and the subtle control he had exercised over Peter. It seemed neat, complete, almost too neat. Margaret poured tea quietly, her hands shaking slightly, and Hamish accepted the cup with a nod. "You'll both be safe now," he said softly, yet the words felt provisional. There was always the chance, he knew, that the final twist remained hidden, like a trapdoor under the floorboards. Alan fiddled nervously with a small wooden carving, his eyes never leaving Hamish's face. It was then that a small sound, almost imperceptible, caught Hamish's attention, a deliberate tap at the window, soft and deliberate, in the same rhythm he had long ago recognized as a signature of careful manipulation. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing. The fog outside seemed thicker in that moment, and a shadow shifted beyond the glass. Hamish's pulse quickened, not in fear but in recognition. The game was not yet over. He moved to the window, cautious and quiet. The shadow melted into the fog as he approached, and Hamish's keen eye caught a small piece of paper, pinned by a loose shutter, fluttering in the wind. Carefully, he retrieved it. The message was written in Crawford's familiar handwriting, but the signature at the bottom was different, subtle and unfamiliar. "You've caught Crawford, but control runs deeper. The final move awaits. Watch the one who smiles the kindest." Hamish felt a chill. All his deductions, all the careful observation had been correct, yet there was one element he had overlooked, the possibility of a second mind, a hidden collaborator, someone who had used Crawford as a pawn. The signature suggested intelligence, patience, and confidence, someone equally capable of anticipating human behavior, yet hiding behind the apparent resolution. He scanned the room carefully. Margaret's eyes were wide, but her composure was steady. Alan fidgeted with the carving, nervous but innocent. His mind replayed every interaction, every micro-expression he had catalogued. Then it struck him. The smallest detail he had noted in the first days, the faint, almost imperceptible way Douglas Millar's personal correspondence had been moved around by someone helping him. The little gestures of kindness that seemed overly attentive, suddenly aligned with the warning on the note. Margaret. Her kindness, so natural and so consistent, had masked a cunning mind capable of patience and manipulation. Hamish's gaze rested on her calmly. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you've been helpful, kind, and careful. But someone who watches this closely, someone who understands rhythm and human response, someone capable of orchestrating Crawford's actions, might not be as innocent as they seem." Margaret's face did not change at first. She merely tilted her head, a faint smile playing across her lips. It was warm, familiar, but there was an edge, a flicker that Hamish recognized instantly. "You understand control," he continued, stepping closer, his voice steady. "You watched, guided, and let Crawford act, all while maintaining appearances. The notes, the pattern, the disappearance, they were calculated. You wanted to see how it would unfold." Her smile remained, calm, almost charming. "I only helped," she murmured softly, "to ensure that no harm came to those I care for, and to test if the village truly understands trust." Hamish exhaled slowly, feeling the tension coalesce. This was the final twist, the last challenge. The true mastermind had been hidden in plain sight, using kindness as camouflage, orchestrating events with patience and precision that rivaled his own detective work. The realization sharpened his focus, his mind racing to anticipate the next move. Crawford had been a pawn. The game was not over. Margaret, the one whose calm and gentle smile had inspired confidence, was far more dangerous and clever than anyone had imagined. The fog outside thickened once more, curling through the streets, carrying with it the silent promise of one last confrontation. Hamish Macbeth, composed and unshaken, understood now that the final truth would demand not just observation and deduction, but the patient, precise strategy that had guided him through the entire investigation. The real game, the one that had been hidden behind the kind smiles of Loch-Dhu, was about to reach its ultimate moment. Hamish Macbeth stood in the quiet of Millar's drawing room, the soft light from the fireplace flickering against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the memory of the past crimes. Margaret's calm smile remained, but her eyes, once so composed, now betrayed a glint of tension as Hamish slowly walked around her, cataloguing each subtle gesture, each pause in speech, each flicker of emotion. He had anticipated her, traced the rhythm of her manipulation, and now it came down to one final reckoning. "You've been clever, Margaret," he said evenly, his voice calm yet edged with authority. "Clever enough to orchestrate Crawford's actions, clever enough to hide behind kindness and propriety, clever enough to make everyone, including me, believe that the threat had ended when, in fact, it was only beginning." Her smile faltered for the first time, just a fraction, but Hamish noticed. That small crack was all he needed to confirm the pattern. Margaret's response was measured. "Cleverness is a matter of perspective, Inspector," she murmured. "I only wanted to protect the village, to see if they were worthy of trust. Crawford, he needed guidance." Hamish shook his head slightly, tracing with his finger the paths of previous events. "You gave him guidance, yes, but your manipulation created fear, orchestrated disappearances, and ultimately, murder. Every small gesture, every seemingly insignificant detail, the tap at the window, the shifted objects, the notes left to taunt and mislead, was part of a rhythm you controlled, a pattern meant to show your superiority over circumstance and human behavior. That's what I recognized. That's what led me to you." Margaret's composure began to waver, subtle but perceptible. She looked toward the window, the fog pressing against the glass like a shroud, then back at Hamish, the weight of inevitability settling over her. You saw the pattern?" she whispered, voice tight. "I did," Hamish replied quietly. "The rhythm was always there. Crawford was a pawn, yes, but every pawn moves according to the strategy of the player. The shard of glass you allowed to vanish, the notes, Peter's disappearance, all carefully orchestrated. Every action designed to manipulate perception, to instill fear, to test trust. And yet even the cleverest rhythm has a vulnerability." Margaret exhaled, her defiance fading into the subtle realization that her psychological chessboard had been read. She stepped back slightly, the tension in her shoulders giving way to resignation, and in that moment Hamish saw the final piece fall into place. Every small, overlooked detail from the beginning. The offhand remarks, the tiny inconsistencies, the almost imperceptible gestures of anxiety, had pointed toward her, the one who smiled with kindness while hiding intent. As the constables stepped in to take Margaret into custody, she lingered a moment longer, her eyes meeting Hamish's. There was no malice, only the quiet acknowledgement of defeat, and perhaps an unspoken respect for the detective, who had seen through the carefully constructed "I." "Illusions, I suppose. You were always one step ahead," she admitted softly. Hamish nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Not always," he said, "but enough to see the truth. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly inconsequential, the taps, the subtle rearrangements, the rhythm of human reaction, they were clues. Clues most would dismiss, but in the end, the pattern cannot be denied." Outside, the fog had begun to lift, and the village of Loch-Dhu breathed again, tentative but relieved. Justice had been served, yet Hamish knew the unsettling truth. People like Margaret, clever, patient, and patient with human psychology, always leave a sense of unfinished business, a shadow in the memory of the crime that no arrest can fully erase. The village would sleep easier tonight, but the subtle reminders of human cunning, rhythms hidden in small gestures, power concealed behind kindness, would linger. Hamish finally stepped out into the cool night air, hands in his pockets, boots splashing softly through puddles in the street. He let the village's quiet settle around him, and for a moment he allowed himself a rare, private smile. The case was concluded, the puzzle solved, the pattern traced to its source. Yet in every shadow, in every subtle human rhythm, he knew there were stories waiting to unfold, mysteries yet to test his patience, his perception, and his unwavering attention to the smallest of details. Loch Dhu was quiet for now, but Hamish Macbeth, ever observant, remained ready. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of Millar's house into the crisp night air, the fog receding slowly, revealing the familiar contours of Loch Dhu's quiet streets. The village seemed to exhale, the tension of recent days dissolving into the gentle hush of midnight. Yet for Hamish, the resolution of Margaret's arrest did not carry the complete satisfaction one might expect. There were too many small details, too many questions lingering at the edges of perception, each one tugging at the corner of his mind like a faint, insistent whisper. As he walked along the cobblestone paths toward the station, his eyes roamed casually, cataloguing shadows, noting where the lamplight flickered, observing the way the fog curled over roof tiles and doorways. A shard of the original glass case from Millar's study had never been recovered. Its absence still puzzled him. Crawford had acted under Margaret's direction, yet who else might have touched it before it vanished? The thought was fleeting, yet it refused to let go. Hamish knew that even the smallest overlooked fragment could prove crucial, a reminder that crime never existed in perfect isolation. Passing the old bakery, Hamish paused. A soft clatter came from the alley beside the shop, a discarded tin can, no doubt, but the timing was uncanny. He crouched, peering into the darkness, noting footprints partially hidden by the returning fog. They were small, lighter than a man's, yet deliberate in their pattern, almost as though someone had been testing the rhythm of the ground itself. Hamish's mind ticked over the possibilities, cataloguing them without rush. The village had been shaken, but these remnants, these tiny echoes of movement, suggested that someone, or something, was still watching, still moving in the periphery. He continued past the loch, the water dark and motionless, reflecting the thin crescent of the moon. The night was deceptively calm, but he sensed, as he often did, that quiet could conceal as much as noise revealed. Even with Margaret and Crawford removed from the streets, he knew the village held layers of secrecy, subtleties of human behaviour, grudges left unspoken, and opportunities for deception. He could feel the hum of anticipation, subtle but real, a signal that mystery was never Uli finite in Loch Dhu. Reaching the station, he exchanged a quiet nod with Sergeant Blair, who looked as relieved as anyone might after weeks of tension. Yet Hamish's gaze lingered on the horizon, noting a figure in the distance, barely more than a silhouette, moving with purpose but careful, almost hidden. It was fleeting, and when he blinked, the figure was gone. A minor detail, perhaps, but his instincts whispered otherwise. Human behaviour, Hamish knew, rarely lies. The faintest hesitation, the smallest shadow, can reveal volumes. Back at Millar's house, Hamish paused at the doorway, glancing at the mantel where the notes had once rested. A single envelope remained, untouched, yellowed at the edges. He picked it up and read the cryptic inscription. "The game is never finished, only paused." There was no signature, no immediate explanation. A shiver of recognition ran through him. The final act might have been played, yet the story itself was far from over. Even in resolution, the threads of human cunning, subtle manipulation, and unsolved riddles remained woven into the fabric of Loch Dhu. Hamish stepped back into the night, the envelope folded carefully in his pocket, and began walking toward the station. Each step was measured, composed, yet alert. He had solved the immediate case, traced the rhythm of deception, and exposed motives long concealed, but in the shadows, in the quiet spaces between one street lamp and the next, he sensed that mystery lingered. Some questions had answers, yes, but others waited patiently, like silent witnesses to human complexity, poised to emerge when least expected. Loch Dhu slept uneasily beneath the lifting fog, the village reassured yet restless, while Hamish Macbeth, thoughtful and vigilant, walked its streets with the certainty of a detective who understood. One immutable truth in a world of human deception, of hidden motives. ND carefully orchestrated lies. The end of one mystery is merely the beginning of another. The game continued, subtle, silent, and unsolved, yet Hamish was ready, attentive to every flicker, every shadow, and every human heartbeat that might reveal what lay just beyond the fog.